There was no more tangled business between the Bush administration and the press than the Plame affair. The conflict that would raise profound questions about reporters' ability to protect their confidential sources has its roots in the administration's march to war.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
In January of 2003, the Bush administration was riding high. In Afghanistan, America had toppled the Taliban. And now the president was preparing the country for a new war.
A brutal dictator with a history of reckless aggression, with ties to terrorism, with great potential wealth, will not be permitted to dominate a vital region and threaten the United States.
They were feeling a kind of confidence. They had a kind of hubris. If you had to look at a few months in this administration as to maybe the perils of overconfidence, you probably would look at these few months.
Saddam has perfected the game of cheat and retreat and is very skilled in the art of denial and deception.
For several months, there had been a steady drumbeat to war.
What he wants is time and more time to husband his resources, to invest in his ongoing chemical and biological weapons program, and to gain possession of nuclear weapons.
There was clearly a set pattern of speeches 2 or 3 times a day to reinforce the WMD thing.
Walter Pincus is a longtime national security reporter for the Washington Post.
First it was nuclear, and then it was the idea that they had chemical and biological.
As we meet, chemists and biologists and nuclear scientists are toiling in weapons labs and underground bunkers, working to give the world's most dangerous dictators weapons of unprecedented power and lethality.
Then it was the idea that they would give it to the terrorists.
The man is a threat, Hutch. I'm telling you. He's a threat not only with what he has, he's a threat with what he's done. He's a threat because he is dealing with Al-Qaeda.
It's just overwhelming, the advantage the government has when it wants to sell a point of view, and that's what they did.
But the Bush administration was also helped by the nation's leading newspapers.
It's important to understand that the number of news organizations that actually have a national security reporter or bureaus overseas and can penetrate the intelligence community are very limited. And the New York Times is at the top of that list. So when the New York Times began to have stories that supported the administration's claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, it had an echo effect. It had an echo effect that the administration was conscious of and employed.
What specifically has he obtained?
We now know that you had people talking to key reporters doing these stories for the Times.
There's a story in the New York Times this morning. This is, and I want to attribute the Times. I don't want to talk about.
Those stories would appear, and then they would reference the very material that they'd given them and say, see, this is coming from the New York Times, not just us.
The kinds of tubes that are necessary to build a centrifuge, and the centrifuge is required to take low-grade uranium and enhance it into highly enriched uranium.
It was a kind of a loop, and it was a conscious loop.
A lot of people wrote, stories that were, I think, overly credulous.
Tom, you have one of the most riveting.
Bill Keller took over as executive editor of the New York Times after the run-up to the Iraq War.
It wasn't some kind of sense of overdeveloped patriotism or an eagerness on the part of reporters to ingratiate themselves with the White House. What it was, reporters want to get on the front page. They want scoops.
It's a very hard area to write about. I was not alone. Many other papers did the same kind of reporting that I did. I think because the New York Times is the paper that it is, and I had written for so long about it, I was...
You were the leader. You were the expert in this area.
I was the alleged expert. There were other experts.
Judith Miller was one of the Times' lead reporters on the WMD story. She had covered terrorism for over a decade.
You've said that you may have gotten some of the stories wrong because your sources were wrong.
Right. They gave me information that I believe they believed. It was information that was given to the president. The national intelligence estimate went to the president. Well, if the president was being given this information, it was the official intelligence assessment of the United States government and the intelligence community. I believed that they wouldn't give the president false information.
She had the wrong sources, and the excuse can't be, I'm only as good as my sources. Now, if you've talked to everyone and exhausted every possible avenue, then you can say that, but no reporter ever does that. So if your sources are wrong, you're wrong, and you have to accept responsibility.
You believe there was WMD in Iraq?
I did.
You said as much publicly.
Yes.
What happens if we go to war against Iraq, we're going to knock them right out, and we find no weapons of mass destruction?
I think the chance of that happening is about zero. There's just too much there. When I say the chances are about zero, that's the way it looked. It was totally wrong. I think I dropped the ball here. I should have pushed much, much harder.
Harder on the skepticism about the reality of WMD.
Yes. In other words, said, hey, look, the evidence is not as strong as they are claiming.
No terrorist state poses a greater or more immediate threat to the security of our people than the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
A al-Qaeda-type network trained and armed by Saddam could attack America and leave not one fingerprint.
We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels.
We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
Many in the media got the WMD story wrong. Frontline aired its own report on the possible threats of Saddam's weapons programs.
When a man known as Saddam's bomb maker went to work.
The way that the press was sold and spun and turned around and just fooled by the White House in the run-up to the war represents more than just a misstory. How can one say that we have a watchdog press after a performance like that?
In fact, there was some WMD reporting that did get the story right.
What we were doing was following reporting, and good solid reporting was telling us one thing, and that's what we wrote.
Clark Hoyt was Knight Ridder's Washington editor during the run-up to the war in Iraq.
What we were hearing from very good sources was really nothing has changed with Iraq.
But as they continued their skeptical reporting, Hoyt says they began to feel heat from the government.
Someone in the Defense Department called our reporter a communistic Bolshevik. Others said, all you guys have in this town is your reputation and your credibility, and we're going to get you. We're going to get that. I will say at times it seemed very lonely because you kept looking around saying, where's everybody else?
The Washington Post had reporters who had also begun hearing doubts about the evidence of WMD in the final days before war.
I started calling people I knew in the Pentagon and finally got somebody who just honestly said, we don't know where they are. We don't know if they are there. And then somebody in the agency did the Potemkin Village idea that Saddam Hussein was making believe he had the stuff when he didn't. That led up to the piece 2 days before the war that it might not be there.
Pincus's story ran on page 13. The lead headline of the Post that day was, President tells Hussein to leave Iraq within 48 hours or face invasion.